So I thought I'd just do like a session on talking about the learnings I've had over the years, just working with event data, how to kind of structure it, things that I've sort of sucked at and gotten better at over time. Cool. Just to kind of start with, interesting. So one of the things that I was thinking about was I come from a city called Karachi, which is in Pakistan, all the way on the other end. One thing that's sort of surprising here is that we are a very densely packed area compared to the rest of the country, and I was just like playing with it in scale. So this is what Amsterdam looks like, and this is what London looks like. This is about like 4K. This is about 7K in population density, and this is somewhere where we are. So it's about 25,000. So we are stacked on top of each other quite a bit. So like my kind of sense of scale and proportion is really different. I think this is also really interesting to think about in terms of events as well. So the data that we tend to use day to day, it's aggregated up from a lot of small actions that happen. So your session is generally a collection of, let's say, 10 events. Your event is one part of that, right? So I think like the density of those things is really interesting. And then I think if you think about events, you can actually dive deeper. So there's within an event, you could have multiple attributes that make that event up, right? So from my perspective, event is sort of like the smallest unit of measurement. You're basically just observing one point in time, at which certain things happen. So it's been really like a starting point of all the log analysis. Everything analytics really started with events, right? But the challenge was that it's really hard to process it, right? At scale, especially if you have millions of these actions happening. So we ended up with things like Urchin, which were just summarizing this data, coming up with new things, definitions for like other things like bounce rate, which is basically just one event happening and nothing else happening after that, right? These are all sort of abstractions on top of that same thing. So I think that's really useful to understand, because then you're not starting from scratch. You're just starting from sort of somewhere upstream, and you're going downstream into something with a little bit more detail. Cool. So this is how I define an event. It's basically one observation, a single record of activity, could be tied to some user, in a consent kind of friendly way. I think it's important to say it these days. And effectively like a snapshot in time, right? So if you were to look at one event, it would just help you see, what happened at one point in time, in someone's journey, right? So for example, this room could be, like everyone sort of walking in could be one event, right? You could think about all of this collection here as number of people that are attending this event, events twice. So that is like sort of the idea, right? And then if you think about events, you really have to think about a few combination of things that are really important, right? So the fundamental thing is that it helps us sort of see some sort of action, right? So you have an action, some activity that has happened that you're tracking, right? So that's like generally the first step, right? And then typically you have that alongside properties. And the reason you have properties is that you want to be able to still do some level of segmentation or slicing and dicing of that data, which wouldn't really be possible without having these properties, right? So for example, for the people in this room, we could have a property of the country that you've come from, right? There could be age, there could be all of these things. So you could sort of have like attributes about that event. Cool. So this is what like a standard kind of event would look like. You have some action there, a page view, a video display, and then you have a property about which would sort of tell you about like things about that event. So it's the simplest kind of form of like tracking. You could work with like just the action, right? But you can add more kind of quality to that data with adding some context with the properties. Cool. The third thing is really important. It's an actor. So it's basically the person or the thing or entity that's performing the action. The reason I use actor and not user is that that's like it doesn't really always have to be a user, right? You could actually, it could be an automated machine. It could be anything that is you want to sort of be able to identify at the level. So if you have all these three, typically, you have a pretty good event. Uh, in most cases, if you think about databases or any other system, there's always some sort of identifier for that role. So at the very base level, that could be the actor. It's just an identifier, but typically an actor is something that is common between a bunch of different actions, so that you can sort of tie them together. Cool. I remember it with Tom Hanks. I don't think it's Tom Hanks. Is it Tom Hanks? No. It's Tom Cruise. Yeah. So there's like some Tom that I used to remember, what an actor is. I just saw like the new ads for Maverick. Top Gun. Yeah. All right. Awesome. So yeah. So just kind of things to remember about actors, right? All does not have to be a user. Could be some sort of a aggregation. So for example, for B2B, it's really relevant to have things like, organization, team account, right? Sort of like the level at your, you're selling the license at, right? It could be an anonymous ID, for example, for GA4, a lot of data does not really have a user ID attached to it. It's still, an actor that's performing it. And, it's also could be like someone that, gets impacted by an action. So one of the things that's really interesting to think about is, in most of our interactions, let's say, take Facebook, you have a person that is, posting a content, and then someone is liking that content. But the result of liking that content is that the other person, is getting a notification, right? So there's this interaction of, groups of people that is happening. So there's actually actors on both sides of that are sort of receiving information, interacting on it. So this like concept is really powerful because you can sort of think of a lot of different, scenarios kind of as a mix of these things together. Cool. And the last one, but of course, probably the most important, is time, right? So everything happens at a point in time, throughout that journey. And if you trace anything back, it would always be, with that snapshot, right? So yeah, times I think is, really interesting because, if you're coming from a Google Analytics world, it was always has to be real time. With everything else, mostly, if you think of events in general, they don't really have to be that way, right? Everything that you do, online automatically has a timestamp attached to it. Whether that you see that timestamp or not, is another question, right? In addition to that, there's a lot of challenges with how you sync time between different systems, how these things go, right? And in most cases, one of the major challenges was that, it's really hard to reprocess data, right? Which is primarily because the pipeline is already, in real time, it's sort of processing data as it comes in, so it's really hard to change it after the fact. The benefit of sort of event-based models is that if you have that as a property, you can always sort of, offset it, change it, or you can actually track multiple timestamps at the same time, right? So you could have a timestamp for the action, it could be one timestamp for, the actual, let's say, date of booking versus the date of redemption of that booking and all of these other things. So it's really interesting to sort of like play with time and see like, what patterns emerge. Cool. So I think life as a series of events, it's the easiest way to imagine things. Something happened and, you were born, and then, all of the series of events that happen after that. But yeah, I think the idea of that is that from those series of events, your journey trying to build, certain groups, aggregations, you're born, you have like, you're a teenager, then you're this, or all of these different categorizations that run on top of these events, which are very distinct but can be connected together based on an actor or a user. Cool. In case of analytics and sort of more practical things, it should journey be mapped to the user journey. You can always have a lot of different events, but it's really important to sort of see like the important checkpoints and sort of at least measure them. So if you're starting with a website or a mobile app, maybe it is about how many people actually first saw it, which would be one event, it would be session start or something like that, right? Then you have maybe how many of them signed up at least, how many of them started, a journey, ended that journey, and the time kind of difference between the two, is interesting to look at. The conversion rate between the two in terms of, the numerator and denominator is interesting to look at based on those things. Cool. The other thing that's really important and I think gets overlooked is, in most cases with events, you're really sort of observing, or assuming that someone is doing that action, right? So the intent of the person isn't really clear, automatically. It's sort of like it's really important to know that, if you're tracking, a lot of users, it doesn't really mean that, automatically like that action is popular or that has, some reason to be popular. So it's so you should always be thinking about the action, in relation to, how it's being tracked and the context of why it was sort of, put in place in the first place. Cool. So these are things that I think are, essential for, a really great event, right? You should always have these kind of 4 things. One is of course the timestamp, which is, for the most part automatically tracked, but, useful to have. The actor of that event, ideally, as close to kind of identifiable as possible, as legally allowed. And then you have metadata about the event, right? So this is things that would be really useful if you wanted to debug something, right? You tracked something, you forgot about it, you got like spammed by a bot, right? So these would be things that would help you sort of figure out the actual data from the noise, right? And then finally, but more importantly, like, properties that would segment the event, right? So things that would kind of give you more context about how these things, like how that event was done, why it was done, what sort of patterns emerge from that. As long as you have these kind of, fundamental things, you should have like a really good event to start with. Cool. So one other thing I think is really important is when you're starting to plan things, it's really important to sort of spend a bit of time thinking about how should you actually, measure these things, right? And by sort of, I think, association, I also think about sort of the overhead that you have of remembering, what something was called. I think all of us have like, set up something and forgot about it, to kind of then have to dig through what happens. So these are like, I think, probably the 2 most kind of common naming conventions, right? One is you have the object first and then the action. The other is action first and then the object. I personally prefer the object action model. One of the reasons for that is that, if you are in a drop down, it's alphabetically sorted. So everything order would sort of come, in one order, right? Versus like having to kind of dig through purchase and then, maybe viewed order or something all in different places. But yeah, it's sort of like, naming convention wise, the more important thing is, you should just be consistent and, sort of keep these things, organized. And yeah, this is a pet peeve. I typically sort of keep things, in past tense because, the action has already happened, but, who knows when, time travel might happen as well, so. Cool. So yeah, let's look at like a few events. This is sort of examples of how I started with events originally, right? One event for each thing, right? One form submitted, demo, right? And then, sort of attributes about that, right? But then the better way of like doing this would be to have one property that would sort of, aggregate it, right? And then have like these attributes, right? This would also sort of make it easy because if you wanted to, let's say, compare all the form submitted events, you could just break it down by that property rather than trying to dig through, all the different event names with form submitted.
Sorry, for that one, what would the benefit be of having the form submit date passing? Because wouldn't that be readily available already?
Yeah, so form submit date, the reason for that would be, in my experience, your interfaces don't really show you the date that they capture the data on. So this would sort of make it so that if you wanted to export the data out or even just look at it, you would just have that available. So it would just be like sort of additional metadata. Cool. And then sort of maybe like one more would be something like a form ID, right? The reason for a form ID is that, someone might decide to kind of, rename the event to something else or like the name of the form, right? So having some sort of context about the identifier that you can tie it to is really useful in some of these cases. Cool. And I think one important thing is to kind of, when you're starting out, just make sure that you document things. The idea of that documentation and the way I organize it is for like it sort of being like the single point of reference for everyone that is going to work with it, starting from the analyst that sort of maps out those events, then to the developer that would implement them, and then finally to maybe someone else in the team or marketing team that would come back and look at it. In most of these cases, the idea really is that you can sort of set all of these different things up. One of the main things that I use very often is the status column, because I imagine that as an analyst I probably said recommend too many events, and then probably there only 5 of them get set up. So it's useful to know what exists now and what doesn't. Right. So so that's like generally sort of like structure. The other thing might be like prioritizing what events are important and when they might come up. Cool. Yeah, awesome. So I think that's everything. Hopefully we have some time to actually talk through, because I'd love to sort of hear about what event tracking is being done. I'm really interested in these areas. So if anyone's like building on any of these things, please ping me. I'd love to chat. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Take questions?
Yeah, please.
I don't know if I should just go up to you or just ask openly, but